Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you're hearing this as an excerpt and you're not yet a patron and you want to hear the whole lecture, please go to my Patreon page. The link should be in the description. And this lecture will be Virginia, Part 1, The Successful Failure. And this is another in my ongoing series on early colonization and the beginnings of colonial North America. This one will be on the founding of Virginia, which in time became the largest and most important colony in North America above the Rio Grande, massively dwarfing contemporary colonies like Acadia and Plymouth, which I'll get to soon. And Virginia was the only mainland colony that could really compete with the West Indies as a site of lucrative cash crop production. So when reading about Virginia to refresh my memory and make notes, I intended to focus mainly on the mid to later 17th century, when Virginia grew explosively to become such a large and valuable colony, and then actually exploded in a massive and destructive uprising that threw the whole English colonial project into doubt. So I didn't want to get too deeply caught up in the early dramas of Jamestown and the often exaggerated myths around these larger-than-life figures like John Smith and Pocahontas. But I found that those events were just too interesting and also too important. The early years of Jamestown were significant just as much for what did not happen as for what did. And so I decided that I would make a first lecture specifically on these first 4 decades or so of the colony of Virginia, and I decided to call it The Successful Failure, which is originally a reference to the space mission Apollo 13. That mission was called The Successful Failure because it failed in its main strategic goal of landing on the moon due to a fuel explosion, but at least it succeeded in getting the astronauts into outer space and then back to Earth alive, with very little resource to fall back on. So early Virginia strikes me, I think, as similar, in that it suffered through various blunders and disasters, and it failed to realize the main strategic aims of the adventurers that launched this mission. But it did at least miraculously survive, such that it would see a degree of success later on. So I'll make this lecture for patrons, and then I will most likely pick up the story from the 1640s and the impact of the English Civil War in another lecture, which will be open to the public. And I'm also going to continue working on a myth of the month on the Industrial Revolution, which is what won the latest poll for the next myth of the month. And I've also been making many notes and collecting clips for a final video on red, white, and royal blue, which should finally get to the point that the whole series is trying to make, and will deal at least some with the inevitable comparisons with heated rivalry and the sensation around that show. But now let's look at the land or country where the colony of Virginia was created in the 1600s. So the colony of Virginia formed in the region that the indigenous people knew for centuries as Senecomica, and that is now in English usually called the Tidewater. And this consists of the lands around the lower Chesapeake Bay and around the 4 large rivers that flow from the mainland southwestward into the bay, namely the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac. So in other words, the lands can be said to comprise, more specifically, a stretch of the North American mainland along the southern banks of the southernmost river flowing into the Chesapeake, which is the James, and 4 long, narrow peninsulas, 3 of them extending from the mainland southwestward towards the bay, lying in between the great rivers, and these are called the Virginia Neck along the James River, the Middle Neck, and the Northern Neck, and then a 4th peninsula simply called the Eastern Shore, which is across the Chesapeake, running between the bay and the Atlantic. So the land all around this so-called Tidewater region, where the waters are, in fact, tidal and brackish, this land is generally low and flat, with marshlands along much of the shores. But in the 1500s, most of this land was covered in deciduous old-growth forests, with large trees, especially oak and hickory, that have wide-spreading limbs, creating dense canopies and open, shaded understories. This terrain extends all along the shores of the Chesapeake and to the north and south along the Atlantic littoral, while to the west, the Tidewater gives way to the so-called Piedmont, where the land becomes more hilly and rocky. And there is a distinct border between the two, basically cutting north to south, which is called the Fall Line. And each of the four rivers that we named, the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac, each of these four flows down from the Piedmont and then hits a series of cascades as it crosses this fall line, and these form the heads of navigation of each of the rivers. So in other words, as one approaches by ship into the bay and up one of these rivers, one will see dozens of miles of low, flat, fertile shore and slow-moving, brackish waters in inlets, until one abruptly reaches the fall line and the land rises up into the Piedmont. So the entire Tidewater region, from the mouth of the bay up to the Potomac, forms a kind of natural unit, and its resources provide an abundant food supply from game and fish, wild plants, and potentially farming, and hence can support a large population. And the indigenous people living here before the English landing called this country, as we said, Tsenocomica, which means the densely inhabited land. And it seems the population around the end of the 16th century was certainly over 10,000, possibly much more. Now, as for the particular people, the ethno-linguistic groups that lived in this country, within the Tidewater, there were several dozen tribes, all of them fairly closely related and speaking similar languages belonging to the Algonquian language group, and hence they are probably somewhat closely related to other Algonquian peoples such as the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki that we talked about in Acadia, far to the northeast. But the people in the Tidewater were much more numerous. Also in nearby areas, such as in the neighboring coastal plains to the north and the south, there was a mixture of different tribes, including some that are Iroquoian speakers. And to the west, in the Piedmont above the fall line, there were Siouan-speaking tribes, occupying large stretches of land. Now, as for how these people lived, the Algonquians in the Tidewater lived in permanent villages, which were supported by farming and gardening. The main staples of agriculture were the so-called three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, which were generally grown together by intercropping in the same fields and tended by the women of the tribe. And this was supplemented also by gathering of wild plants, fishing in the waterways, and hunting of wild game and birds, mainly by the men. Each tribe tended to center on a main central village, and each had a distinct territory with designated hunting grounds. As for the leadership and authority in these tribes, each tribe was led by a chief called a werowance, and this position was generally inherited matrilineally. But it did not necessarily carry a lot of formal powers. Rather, he or she would build their authority through personal prestige and influence, and through skills like warfare and oratory. And the werowances would govern in consultation with tribal councils and elders. They usually had fairly little hard power, at least as compared to European rulers at the same time. But at the time of European arrival in this country, the political arrangement was in flux, with power becoming more centralized than had been usual previously, and great authority being wielded by one man who was called Powhatan. So who is this person? He was a kind of paramount werowance, or paramount chief, holding sway over most of the Tidewater. It seems he was born around 1550, and his given name actually was Wahunsunakuk, and he came from the tribe of Pamunkey, and he grew up in a home village called Powhatan. So in formal contexts, he tended to be called by that name of the original home domain where he had been raised. Sort of like the King of Norway at this same time might just be called Norway, or Old Norway as he's referred to in Hamlet. Or an English earl like the Earl of Essex might just be called Essex. So similarly, this leader was commonly called Powhatan. And when he took up leadership of the Pamunkey, it seems he also inherited a position of suzerainty over 4 or 5 other tribes, mainly around the James River, which had already given their fealty to the Pamunkey. Then over the course of his career, he subjugated about 25 more tribes all around the Tidewater, thus creating a confederated state, which today is called the Powhatan Confederacy, which had its capital at Werowocomoco on the north bank of the York River. And from this central location, Powhatan and his court controlled most of the Tidewater, and they had a subject population of about 8,000 to 9,000 people.